Hey, y'all. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my upcoming book that I'm working on. And it's all about, it's called Reboot Your Conversation OS. And I talk about the operating system in another video. But what I wanted to talk about here is the idea that most people who I talk to in conversation tend to think about conversation as dialogue. You know, one person talking to another person. And that is definitely a real conversation. And our lives are 100% built every day through successful conversations or unsuccessful conversations. And our ability to be in deep dialogue with people, the deeper you can go with people, the more transformative it is for your life, 100%. But for me, I actually started with a bigger conversation. And I think of it as a conversation for two reasons. I was always working with teams. My background's in design thinking, strategy, innovation. And for a long time, I've been training teams on design thinking and facilitation skills, partly so that they can have a good team conversation with themselves, right? And come to great decisions and create a really powerful, amazing, wonderful product services, call it an offering, whatever that offering is, to a community. Draw some people in the background there. That's a community. And it's a conversation. An offering is a conversation because, good God, it doesn't go in one way. It's an adaptive conversation that goes back and forth. This is an agile process of figuring it out if the offering works for the community and listening to them and making it better. And the more fluid the team conversation, the more fluid the offering conversation can be, and the better it can be. And that's awesome. What I was doing was having this fluid conversation with teams, like me as myself. Having this, call this facilitation conversation. I didn't think about it as conversations. I really saw it as different pieces. And it wasn't until back in 2015 that I started working with a group in Australia called Second Road. I did some consulting work with them, and they call this process conversation design. The process of helping a team see a new future for their offering and getting there, changing the direction of their conversation. At first, I had a lot of resistance to it. I'll be honest, it felt a little wonky for me. But then I began to think, well, if this is a conversation, what are other conversations? And this is when I started to break down this idea of conversation design. And that's when I started the podcast, The Conversation Factory, and started interviewing people about how they designed all of these different conversations, slicing it into little pieces and trying to make sense of it all. A lot of the conversation theory that the OS comes from is based on dialogue. And it's been very interesting learning how to adapt it to these other pieces. And so as I started to realize that there was this, this interface, just as there's an interface between when I'm talking to another person, that interface is air or a cell phone or email. There's an interface between teams and community. And that is the way their company is organized, the org design, right? And that org design will either help or hurt this conversation. That's something I really have in my own work started to try and affect more and more because it's how the real change happens. And so began to really start to structure this idea of like really big conversations like org design and community design, doing interviews with people on both of these spectrums on the podcast, and also really small ones, right? Understanding great dialogue, negotiations, and then all the research around the self-conversation. And this is when I began to realize that, good God, was I taking good enough care of myself? And the truth is, the innovation leaders who I talk to, by and large, I think we're all looking externally and leaving very, very little for ourselves. And so the diagram, I just started to ask myself, if this is true, what else is true? And so I began to realize that it is important to have a community, to build a community well before you need it. And the reason is so that you can be in dialogue with that community and pull people out of that community to help you expand your mind, to be mentors or coaches. And that's when I began to realize, like, why don't I have a coach? I'm coaching teams and leaders. I didn't have my own. And so I looked at this diagram as check, check, check. What am I not checking off? And so I realized I didn't just actually have to have a coach. It wasn't enough to just pay them the money and come to the sessions. I actually needed to leave time to bring that dialogue into myself. And that conversation I'm starting to call reflection or processing. This is about reflection and processing. You try writing, spelling correctly, and speaking at the same time, then come back to me. So, it's nicely balanced. Org design is sort of over there. I apologize. But really, I look at org design and I think the reason I drew this as a spiral is because when you expand it out, you begin to realize, what is the organizational principle behind all of this? What are the cultural norms, rules, expectations that all of this is happening in? What rules can we break? What can we bend? How can we change them? And in the center, I always draw this little infinity sign, and this is about the adaptive balance between all of them, because you can't focus on everything all at once. It's a lot. I get it. I put the self at 1, reflection 2, dialogue 3, mentorship 4. This is not an order of priority-ish. It's in size order, but I think the self is what it rests all on. If you don't take care of yourself, if you don't put your own oxygen mask on first, the whole thing falls apart. Community is 5. Offering design is 6. The team conversation is 7. Facilitation is 8. So there's 8 here. Org design and this culture conversation I link together as 9. And this adaptive one is the 10th. So there's 10 conversations or modes of conversation that I think the conversation OS applies to. And you can reboot any of these. You can reboot the team conversation, the team skill conversation. You can reboot your product conversation. You can reboot your community. And I think it's always worth doing if you feel a gap to look at what you can change. And that's what the conversation OS is all about. And there's another video which I'll link to that talks more about this.